The paper I'm about to present was originally intended as a text accompanying the Canadian pavilion of the 2020 Biennale of Architecture in Venice, an event postponed to this year because of the COVID crisis. The theme of the pavilion was Impostor Cities, and I have stolen that concept for this paper. But as you'll see, the paper is itself about theft. The paper is also about this city, my city, Winnipeg, which is a mid-sized, Midwestern place in the center of Canada, and in fact in the geographic center of North America. But it's very far from anywhere else. It has a small but active filmmaking community, including a number of strong independent filmmakers and about $200 million in mainstream industry filmmaking per year. That's 200 million Canadian dollars, but still it's not insignificant. Winnipeg can be used this way, in part, because of a rich but checkered history that has produced a diverse urban and regional environment that can represent anything from metropolis to shantytown, polar ice cap to desert. It is, in fact, a realization of what Lev Manovich has referred to as the Frankenstein space of cinema, a space cobbled together from different parts. I'm going to talk about what Winnipeg's involvement in that industry, specifically what the harvesting of the city's spaces as filming locations might really be about, not just for this city, but for the global industry and for cities like this around the world. Sean Penn's Flag Day, not yet released, is named for June 14th, the anniversary of the adoption of the Stars and Stripes as the national flag of the United States. In this film, Penn plays a counterfeiter, that is, a maker of signifiers, dollars, representing the American state. A dollar's value depends on its perceived authenticity. This assures its capacity to be exchanged for not just any other dollar, but any other thing. A flag is another signifier and shares something with the dollar. It combines identity and interchangeability. If any of the flags arrayed here awaiting a parade is replaced by a similarly designed flag, it will still mark the space in which it's raised, in this case Minneapolis, as American. In fact, though, the street where these flags are hung is itself counterfeit. As you can see from the lonely Canadian flag sticking up just out of the cinematic frame, this is not an American city. It is the city of Winnipeg, in the province of Manitoba, at the center of Canada. If it shares many qualities with Minneapolis, Midwestern, riparian, the site of agriculture-based industry, a gritty city, it is not that city. Minneapolis is represented in this particular scene by the Exchange District, 30 blocks of former warehouses and financial services buildings dating from the turn of the 20th century. This area was named for the grain exchange, the place where prairie crops were bought and sold. So it was, in its early history, about the exchange of money for goods and back again. Even today, it is the location of Canada's only commodity futures exchange focused on barley and canola. In such film and television projects, Winnipeg's urban spaces are harvested for, on the one hand, their grit and authenticity, and on the other hand, their ability to appear like somewhere else, to imposture. Winnipeg is paradigmatic of the Impostor City. More often plays Chicago. Here's the Exchange District again, playing the role of a large Midwestern city in the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford in 2007. There is a resonance between the city's, any city's role in exchange, and its role in the exchange of images and meanings back and forth between local and global, reality and story. Stories that resonate afar often make use of realities that are at hand. At least that is what happens in our city. As Siegfried Kracauer once said of Fritz Lang's Metropolis, the trite stories films pretend to tell often smuggle across the boundaries of consciousness the rich contraband of real histories, dramas, and traumas. This paper is about those traumas, which charge the urban spaces of Winnipeg and other cities. What is going on here is some more complex condition of exchange. As a space of exchange, it may not be surprising that a film about a robber should be told here. In fact, robbery, theft, in a word, the heist, is a recurring subject of moving images shot in Winnipeg. The obverse of the 19th century exchange is this landscape, a hollowed-out downtown full of parkades. It resulted from post-war middle-class flight to the suburbs, which left many inner-city buildings empty. These voids have been exploited in a number of industry productions, including Jonas Åkerlund's Horseman of 2009, which at first appears to be about murder. In this clip from Horseman, the cinematographer's eye identifies the urban desolation of generic modern buildings, flanking a swath of parking lots. This is immediately adjacent to the Exchange District. In this film, these spaces are markers of an American city, one similarly hollowed out, Detroit. In Horseman, the spaces of Winnipeg's downtown are the setting for a story of the hunt of a serial killer. That hunt leads to this building, the Bell Hotel at 662 Main Street. The Bell was built in 1906, when Winnipeg was at the apex of its success, and considered a rival to Chicago even, largely because of its position at the center of Canada's rail network. That didn't last long. The city boom times began to decline in the late 1910s and 20s, followed by the stock market crash, the Depression, the war, and flight to the suburbs. By the end of the 20th century, the Bell had become housing of last resort, a rooming house, many of whose residents suffered from mental illness and addiction. Desperation was inherent in the area's narrative, and it was a quality harvested by the makers of Horsemen. They sat a ritualistic murder in one of the Bell's rooms. At the time, the Bell Hotel was built and the Exchange was turning into a small Chicago. Another part of the city was growing too. The city's wealthy were beginning to migrate to the early suburbs in the south, including this house in Crescentwood on the Tony Boulevard of Wellington Crescent. Horsemen harvest this neighborhood as the site of another ritualistic murder. The abuse of a child leads to the murder of a parent and incidentally of another child in utero. Horsemen is a breeding ground for crimes in which children are implicated, but for which authority figures are ultimately held responsible. Both the Bell Hotel and this house are the scenes of particularly grisly murders, but as the story unfolds, we learn they are evidence of a greater horror. The killer, or leader of several killers as it turns out, has based the series of murders on excerpts from Revelations, the book in the Bible. The investigation uncovers that what has happened here is not just a murder, but the preparation for an apocalypse. Apocalypse is another narrative trope for which films harvest Winnipeg spaces. I Still See You, 2018, uses another corner of the Exchange, Albert Street, to represent the epicenter of an apocalypse. The Exchange District has been transformed by an industrial accident. Off limits to most, this zone is inhabited by remnants, traces or ghosts of past lives, one of whom is implicated in a murder. These ghosts relive traumatic moments of their lives in repeating loops of time, and we see evidence in the people wandering around the site that these loops date back as far as the American Civil War. This is ostensibly American cinematic space. It harvests a site-specific history, though, from which Winnipeg has inherited its own ghosts. That is a history of class and racial conflict played out in the geography of the city. At the time the Bell Hotel and the house in Crescentwood were built, the city was divided into a north end of poverty, where new immigrants made their home, and the south, inhabited by a mostly Anglophone elite. The immigrants, most of them from Eastern Europe, worked at the jobs created by the agriculture-based industry that had produced Winnipeg's boom times. Conflict came to a head in the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919, a landmark moment in world labor history. The strike brought the city to a standstill at the north as the north and south clashed in and around the Exchange District in a battle that was really about who was stealing what from whom. The battle was fought across an urban geography which has continued to contribute to social segregation based on income, as well as being fertile ground for cinematic location scouts. Perhaps the reason Winnipeg's spaces serve such stories is that Winnipeg's history has been, not just in moving image, but in reality, the sign of heist, murder, and apocalypse. We'll turn next to another genre of film, horror, and another urban environment. The suburb is that region which in the post-war era grew fat, as inner cities throughout North America grew thin. In Winnipeg, roads that had begun as cart tracks were widened into highway-scaled boulevards and came to serve as conduits to the post-war suburbs. These evolved from a gridiron plan to today's endless labyrinths of curling roadways and lots, which fan out into the prairie landscape. Decried by urbanists, even as they sell like hotcakes, these later modes of land development create enclaves cut off from the city proper. Such neighborhood is the setting of a season of the television series Channel Zero, No End House of 2017. Horror and the monster film have been particularly productive genres in Winnipeg. The so-called no-end house mysteriously appears and disappears in different cities. Where it appears, it serves as a portal into an identical but different suburb. This neighborhood and those who populate it are, like the remnants of I Still See You, all about memory. Feeding off the memories of visitors lured into the house, they become their doubles, their doppelgangers, their counterfeits, their impostors. One of these is a father who threatens his children, as in Horsemen. We learn through a reveal near the end of the series that he is an architect. The series is shot in Oakbank, a bedroom community outside Winnipeg. It presents the buildings there as simultaneously icons of home, yet eerily absent of any home-like qualities. They are emphatically unheimlich. The unfinished spaces that so often accompany newly built developments, backs of closets, incomplete rec rooms, function as opportunities for escape, but they also serve as traps, as does the suburban geometry as a whole. That trap has several manifestations, from the maze-like layout of the streets to a cage around a residential traffic island in which a family is imprisoned. Another trap manifested in this space is a corn maze barring the way out of the neighborhood. The hungry memory eaters wander within it, and bodies well up from dark pools. An outlandishly tall water tower overlooks the community. Taken as a whole, these spatial tropes depict a space part agricultural, part urban, but not satisfactorily either. It is a dream built on the idea of escape that ends up becoming a trap. This is how suburbs are often interpreted, as places built to satisfy the desire for rural life that in the end destroy the farmland they are built over. But in the case of Western Canada, there is much more to this story. The farms themselves have been complicit in destruction. Beginning in 1871, 1 million square kilometers of wild prairie land was marked out in a Cartesian grid by the young Canadian government. You can see this in this aerial view, the square grid surrounding the city. Divided into mile-square sections, a landscape formerly boundless and open became exchangeable, like currency. It was provided to new European immigrants in exchange for their transformation of the gifted land into wheat fields. This gift had in fact been stolen. The First Nations of Manitoba, that is, the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, the Dakota, and the Dene peoples, were signatories of 6 treaties with the federal government, which made specific guarantees in exchange for the use of this land. They never received the bulk of what had been promised them. Instead, they were assigned unwanted squares in the grid, small reserves inadequate for survival. The Métis, the nation descended from First Nation and mainly French and Scottish communities who moved here over a century earlier, didn't receive even that. One can still see the traces of former Métis lands, what is known as the Métis long lot system, colliding with the colonial grid in aerial views of Winnipeg. Their rebellion, led by Louis Riel, whose statue stands today overlooking the river by our provincial legislative building, was suppressed by the federal government in what was referred to at the time by American observers at the New York Times as a military reign of terror in which the indigenous population was subject to assault, murder, and rape. This was the prelude to the founding of Winnipeg, the boom which, within a few decades, was to turn this wheat city into one of North America's key metropolises. So, it is no exaggeration to suggest that the immense grid of farmland into which the prairie landscape had been transformed was an apocalyptic ground. The image of that agricultural landscape is today itself another of the region's cinematic crops, perennially exploited for its poignancy and a lingering sense of threat. This is what happens in Capote, concerning the brutal murder of a family, or in How It Ends, a film literally about the end of the world. In such stories, Manitoba's landscape stands in for anywhere in the Midwest. For indeed, throughout the North American prairies, the same story played out, as the land was co-opted by similar regimes of colonization and control. The transformation of the prairies was a political, social, economic, and technological project. Its grid of roadways connected to railways turned the prairie into an immense machine for production of grain, and its delivery mainly to Europe. These colliding grids, rivers, roads, and railways produced a hybrid space that cannot be described as merely urban or rural, technological, agricultural, or wild. Adjacent to the rail lines, or in spaces created by other elements of industrial and development infrastructure, we can still find vestiges of prairie landscape that predate European settlement. Always contaminated by their proximity to industrial infrastructure, these spaces lie fallow, though they are today under growing development pressure. As in other cities, such spaces often become homes for the marginalized. If we seek a figure in the landscape that could describe such spaces of decay and latent fecundity, it might be in the slough, a prairie pond filled by seasonal flooding, often swamp-like. In its more general definition, slough can refer to a place of deep mud or mire, or a mass of dead tissue, shed or cast off from the body, as in the term to slough off. We might find interesting in this respect another recent project shot in Winnipeg. This is the Amazon Studios series, Tales from the Loop. Based on a series of paintings and episodic narratives by Swedish artist Simon Stallenhag, the story is set in an alternate 1980s. It concerns a semi-rural community built atop a fictional piece of technology, the loop. As the technology and the state associated with it ages and decays, it begins to malfunction. The landscape and people above are affected by distortions in space and time. Buildings are overgrown with organicized cabling. Carbon-based and steel bodies are transposed. Time loops move people and creatures back and forth from the past. The juices of the machinery leak into the environment. This and other stories by Stallenhag are all set in spaces generated by the decay or derailment of industrial infrastructure. While the tales from this loop were originally set in Sweden, they have been relocated for the purposes of the television series to an American Midwestern state. But of course they are shot in Canada. The stories have also migrated across media. Before becoming a television series, Stallenhag's images evolved across paintings, texts, and role-playing game. Their transmission depended on a complex transmedial environment operating through global networks and spanning different cultural environments that nevertheless exhibit an eerie commonality. Stallenhag commented during a visit to Winnipeg's filming locations, how weird it was to come so far from home and to find himself in a place so similar to the landscape of Sweden. These landscapes are rural-urban hybrids generated out of an immense framework for massive and rapid development that, intended to transform the world, ultimately warped it. So too are all the spaces we have looked at. They feed the creation of a Frankenstein city in which filmic perception sews together different places, not just within the films, but across the planet. This translation of stories from place to place suggests the difficulty of answering in any straightforward way the question, what city is this? The Impostor City is always something different from what it seems, or even from what it seems to seem. Disguised as somewhere else, it secretly represents itself. And if it is transmitted across the world, it is because it also represents, well, the hidden places behind those cities and buildings it is meant to imposture, their own secret histories and anxieties. The question, whose city is it, is just as fraught. Winnipeg is, to use Owen Taves's term, a stolen city. No matter how culturally significant is the Indigenous presence in this city today, the majority of Winnipeg's population can be seen as pretenders, that is, those who set forth a false claim to ownership. Perhaps this is the reason that Winnipeg is so well suited to the role of imposter. It is inherently a counterfeit city. Filmmaking and architecture as arts are entangled in the condition I've just described. As usually practiced, they are highly dependent on complex and global networks of capital, labor, and technology. It should perhaps come as no surprise, then, that the ruins of those projects are a preoccupation for both creators of moving images and of the built environment. Indeed, architects and developers often show a particular interest in the spaces harvested by films. Because they are broken spaces, they are cheap, and they are undervalued. They have, like Deleuze's any space whatever, a richness in potentials or singularities which are, as it were, prior conditions of all actualization. They are full of potential, at once barren and potentially fecund, fallow. The Bell Hotel, cited in Horseman, is a case in point. It's on the left of this picture. You can just see the sign there. In 2011, within 2 years after the filming of Horseman, the building was redeveloped into the Bell Hotel Supportive Housing Complex. This includes 42 units of permanent housing for individuals who have experienced homelessness and shared facilities for cooking, dining, administration, and cultural activities. Bell's former role as a boarding house is back, but better, it remains in this renewed and supported role today. To the right, in the same space, are two related projects, Thunderbird House and Indigenous Cultural Center, designed by Douglas Cardinal, a Blackfoot architect, and Pop-Up Public Washrooms by Bridgman Collaborative Architects, a local firm. Two projects engaging, like the Bell, with the spatial and social needs of the area. There are many more examples of this around the city and also in rural communities. Perhaps we can identify some form of redemption here. A cityscape which has been so productive of spaces supporting visual stories that belong elsewhere somehow manages to tell its own story and adds to it, not only in film, but in the built environment. In this context, film can't simply be seen as a representation. It is part of all that it represents. As the boundary between things and representation becomes hard to define, the line between real and counterfeit is also blurred. What might this mean for our notions of exchange? If one thing cannot be opposed to another in any straightforward way, it cannot simply stand in for it. Neither can it be traded for it. To represent, one thing must to some extent be translated into or embedded in its other. The relation of sign to signified becomes cinematic. Spaces in their image become one flesh. So while it is true that images harvested from the city are bought and sold, that exchange always implies that something else is being smuggled in along with the goods. And a renewed city slips its way across the boundary of the screen, becoming perhaps a little bit more than just an imposter.